Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the territory of the Klayklay Nation. I appreciate Regional Chief Terry Tegee taking us through that. And in fact, he explained when we met with him yesterday that Prince George is in this traditional territory, and the meaning of that territory is the confluence of two rivers. And to some extent, that's the theme of my talk. The talk today, the purpose of the talk really, is to build on the past and the present and look at the future and imagine for BC a resilient, sustainable, prosperous economy in a society that has opportunities for everyone, as the Premier laid out yesterday. First of all, though, congratulations on the conference itself. Dan and Sarah and others have put a great conference together. Thank you for that. They're excellent speakers. Even though I've been here a couple of times before, this time I've learned a lot around the natural resources areas. The speakers, the panel members, etc., have been just great. Yesterday I spent part of the morning at Canfor at the Innovation Industrial Center here in Prince George, and that was a real eye-opener. It was great to go around. The enthusiasm of the people, the idea of new products that may be coming out of that area, etc., was really excellent. So this gathering together of business, of government, of academia, rural, indigenous groups, we certainly are better together, as the logo says. So if we are to look at this future, imagine a future together, and that's really what I'd like you to do, if you can, with me at this time. We're certainly fortunate, first of all, to live in a province and a country that has abundant natural resources. And we have forests, and we have minerals, and we have natural gas, and we have fisheries, we have agriculture, we have fresh water, we have coasts, we have our environment, we even have proximity to the US, for better or worse, and we have BC talent. Really, BC talent, to some extent, is part of our natural resource. So let me move ahead to where we now need to talk about that future. I come from a business background, and so starting any presentation, I have to at least have the small print up there. And that small print, for those of you at the back that can't see it, says basically, while these are forward-looking statements represent my current judgment on what the future holds, they are subject to risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results to differ materially. And I think we all know what that is, and now I've gone into government, I think that's just as appropriate as in the business sector. Other people have put this a different way. They've said it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. I think Yogi Berra usually gets tagged with that one. So let's look a little bit at the future for BC. The issue is that we can imagine that, but there are headwinds. And we've talked a lot at this conference about the headwinds. And those headwinds from time to time can become overwhelming or seem to be overwhelming. We talked about trade uncertainties, the idea of tariffs by tweet. We've talked about potential recession because of our debt leverage. We've talked about being tied to commodity prices. We're talking about geopolitics. We're talking about consumer spending that sometimes goes up and down, construction real estate that may go up and down as well. And on top of all of that, if we don't have enough, the federal parliamentary budget officer basically said that our tax system in Canada, is going to have to be looked at if we're going to maintain our investments in health. So we have all these headwinds. And what can help us to some extent with those headwinds? Well, I believe, and it's not just because I'm Innovation Commissioner, although that may be fairly obvious, but I do believe that innovation is a core part of our dealing with these headwinds as we look at a future for British Columbia. I wouldn't have taken on the job if I didn't believe that seriously. And what is innovation? Well, there are various definitions. It actually applies across to everything that we do, and each of us are involved in this every day. Innovation is the manifestation of human potential and creativity. It allows societies to solve problems, seize new opportunities, and achieve higher standards of living. Innovation is what makes businesses thrive. In its widest sense, if you look at the history of the human race, then innovation has allowed us to some extent to manage and survive over many, many, many years. I don't know whether if you go through the airport and you see that book, Homo Sapiens, by Yuval Noah Harari. It's an interesting book. I wouldn't recommend his other ones necessarily, but that one does give a history of some of the innovation that humankind has developed over the years, so that we now can sit here today in relative security and peace. So innovation, the way I'm looking at it now, is really the creation and adoption, and it's particularly true around adoption of a new technology or a new idea, process, and product that generates sustained social and economic value. And Jill Tipping gave a good background to that yesterday, so I won't go into it necessarily. But it is important that it's not always revolutionary. It's not just products, it's processes, etc. It's not just developing technology, although it is the link between technology and the economy. But we see it in various forms. We've talked at this conference about regulatory innovation, for example, and Paul Jeekins, who was here yesterday, of the BC Oil and Gas Commission, has talked about that before and how important that is in our natural resource area. Marketing innovation. Many of you are involved in companies and you're finding new markets, and you know the innovation that's required in that. In fact, digital customer acquisition is one of these buzzwords at the moment, which is so important for industries all over the world to understand. Procurement innovation. Procurement drives a lot of our opportunities, especially in communities, and this is a really important area. So why is this important? And I'm not going to go through the economics of it, but I hope in a fairly simplistic diagram, you can see that if you invest in innovation, it does drive prosperity and growth. And research has shown that essentially innovation can help in productivity, in exports, employment, etc., and all of those have a positive impact on GDP growth. There can be short-term disruption, and I think we all at times need to realize that not all these words that we use are necessarily seen positively, because disruption is a significant issue because it affects our jobs, etc. Many of us think that perhaps going back to the good old days would be a good thing. However, we tend to forget that actually they were the bad old days in many ways. So whereas there can be disruption, there are also opportunities, and that's the area that I'd like to focus on. The Bank of Canada, Stephen Pullos, has talked about that in the last several months. And so although we may have disruption in jobs, etc., there are also others opening up. I mean, I think it was interesting the same week that GM announced their closure of the Oshawa plant, GM also announced nearly, I think, 2,000 jobs or so in Toronto around technology for automobiles. And this is important because this circle, if you like, invest in innovation, increase in the production in the economy, stronger economic growth leading to more revenues and more revenues to government as well, because we need that to reinvest, as the Premier said yesterday, in social and economic programs. And that's why actually buy local is really important. We've had a buy local push, if you like, or an announcement, I think it was just before Christmas, about how important that is in our agricultural area. It's also important in the innovation area. Innovation bubbles. People want to talk to each other about it. Young people want to associate with others who think in that same way. They want to bounce ideas off each other. And so if we can develop a more innovative economy in British Columbia, and part of that is our understanding each time we buy something, can we buy local in the sense of circulating that knowledge, that innovation in BC, then it's really important. This diagram's also important because we've talked a little bit about the waves of innovation. When there's a wave of innovation, yes, there are lots of opportunities. There are also opportunities for companies, etc. And we've had, over the years, many of them. We've had Industrial Revolution, of course, the age of steam, the age of electricity, mass production. Depending on whether the World Economic Forum thinks we're in the fourth one, and essentially ICT. I think what's really exciting to me, and I'll talk more about this at the end, is the fact that I think the next wave of innovation, and we've talked a lot about it at this conference, is really sustainability. Is looking to see if across the world we want to accomplish things, we can do that. And that's a little bit, if you go back to all of the previous waves of innovation, that's really what's driven it. It's made that difference, but it's made a difference in people's lives. And I think we see that in this area that we've talked about at this conference in sustainability. So just a digression for a moment about what this job actually is. It's the first time there is an innovation commissioner, and I particularly appreciate Minister Ralston for pushing ahead on this, and his support, the support of the Premier and his colleagues. But innovation if innovation is important to our future prosperity, how do we focus on it? That's really the question. And the government recognized this and set up really three parts of a structure: the Emerging Economy Task Force, Innovate BC, and the Innovation Commissioner, and that's me. And really, as I was introduced, the focus is increasing our investment in innovation, really. And how do we do that, both from the federal government, internationally, and also in the province itself? So just a couple of, maybe since this is lunchtime, and since just a personal story or two of why do I feel strongly about this particular area. So after university, I went up to Ottawa, worked in the federal government for the space program. And in those days, as you can tell many years ago, Canada really had a push, if you like, for opening up really around our natural resources, so opening up Canada. So communications across Canada, etc., doing remote sensing, for example, for our resources and our environment. Canada was the third nation in space. And this was a very interesting time because it was really around economic sovereignty in those days. And we were talking at the table, that can work both ways. But in some ways, it led to a collecting together and pulling together around a common objective. And I was sent out as a young scientist from time to time to deal with emerging companies in those days. One of those was McDonnell Detweiler in BC. And McDonnell Detweiler was very interesting. If you trace back the tech sector a little bit in BC, they really were the first big company to bring together what was structured software in those days. I mean, came out of IBM and others, but structured software, along with a very creative side. And that creative side then was put to work in terms of visual images for satellite work. And I learned a lot from dealing with them. And in those days, because I came out to BC a lot, dealt with MDA, dealt with Macmillan Bloedel in those days and their research center out here, BC Tel, Finning, Schlumberger, Tech, Cominco, etc. And these were very interesting times. And interesting, just an aside on that, the tech sector then went on, if you like, with Don Matrick starting the Distinctive Software Inc., etc., from that understanding that we had of bringing together really these two streams, these two rivers of software was happening on one side and the creative side on the other. And BC, to some extent, has been a leader in all of those areas. The second area that I was involved in, it seems like only a couple of years ago, was at a slightly younger time. I was the project leader for what was called a search and rescue satellite system, and I didn't crash this plane. But essentially what we were doing was putting together, in those days, and I was involved with Telesat and putting a lot of the stations up north and so on, would fly around in these small aircraft. And it was really quite dramatic in terms of risks, I think, in those days. I'm very thankful still to be here. But part of it was that actually finding aircraft, and particularly if it was going to snow at all, is nearly impossible once the aircraft goes down. So the search and rescue system was really a way to make sure that we could find lost aircraft or ships, etc., as it went on to be. It was very interesting because BC was the first case in the world of this being used, and it was this aircraft. And it's a long story which I could talk for an hour about, but it was essentially young pilot In fact, there were 2 pilots on that particular plane, and somebody who was being transferred from Dease Lake over to Dawson Creek, and they went down. Thankfully, they had an emergency locator transmitter on board. That normally would have meant there were several days before they would have been found by an overflying aircraft. Luckily, with the satellite, they were able to be saved that next morning. And the pilot would not have survived if that hadn't happened, because he had severe injuries. And it's interesting because we had a reunion about a few years ago, I think a 30th reunion about of that time. The pilot went on to be one of the top pilots in United Airlines, and also flying the 747s and the 787s that they now have. That system also went on to become a world leader. Today, if you go out of cell phone range and you take a personal locator beacon with you on 4 or 6 megahertz, then you can be found. Essentially, that signal goes back to a central point, and our rescue coordination centers then can find where you are. Canada remains a leader in this area, and it was all because we took that first step in something that people said couldn't be done, and we learned out of that if there's a real need and there's really good technology, we can be that world leader, and I think we can be in natural resources as well. Innovation can take place in operations, it can take place in new businesses, it can take place in new products, and I'll talk a little bit about those areas. So if we look at innovation in those 3 areas, and we look at some of the discussions that we've had today, if we look at mining, and this picture goes back a long, long way, I think it's about 100 years or so, but it's been interesting because part of the discussions that we've had is that there's very sophisticated technology in the mining business today. You just have to talk to Brian Cox, who's here, John Thompson, Tom Sire, all of Peter Robb, etc., and you can hear about the countless innovations, not only in operations, but also in new products and associated businesses and services around mining. Mining's interesting because Vancouver, and particularly BC, became a center for that, and so the secondary industry that came out of that, the financing of mining, etc., the engineering that came out of mining, etc., is still resident in many cases in BC, which is great. And even in today's device and electronics-driven era, we'll need to continue to rely on base metals like copper, lithium, zinc, cobalt, etc. The World Bank is looking at a study of that now. And it's the same thing in oil and gas. We just had a session on oil and gas here. And it's moved a long way from some of the drilling that we used to do back many, many years ago. And again, you can talk, we had a talk from Andy Kalitz, talked to Michel Char, to Dave Nicolation, Susanna Pierce, etc., about many other things that are going on here. Electrification we heard about in the previous session. And even in the terms of the downstream chemical building blocks. I happened to be on a mission to Asia, one of the government missions on LNG about 4 years ago, and I remember the president of KOGAS met with a group, and he said, if we sign a deal, it'll be a 50-year deal, but he said, in that 50 years, things will change. We want to understand how to use LNG in all sorts of other ways. Is it the beginning of a hydrogen economy? Can we use the breakdown, if you like, of LNG in various ways? And so we need to be part of that equation. That's what builds our innovation here. For a number of years, I was on the board of a Calgary company in the oil and gas business, providing technology there, and I saw how directional drilling just changed the industry. I mean, it changed the geopolitics of everything as well, with the US becoming self-sufficient. But we are able to pull together at times. And one example of that we've talked about in this area is the Natural Gas Innovation Fund, Federal Provincial Industry Fund, and we want to be, according to that fund, a global leader in the clean tech innovation areas around natural gas value chain. So it's the value chain, it's not just the extraction, it's the whole thing. The same thing is true in forestry. I mentioned going out to Canfor, and that was a really eye-opening experience in terms of the number of products that they've been talking about. There are very interesting groups there, and you hear this from not just Canfor, but many others, James Gorman, Dave Peterson, Corrine Stavnos, that we talked to at Canfor, etc. They can tell about the increasing demand. We've talked about the buildings getting taller. Sumitomo, who's talking about a 70-story building. It'll be interesting to see how that happens. Bioenergy is in there as well for carbon emissions, etc. That's good. Biochemicals used in many different areas. Biodegradable plastics, fiber cement, my favorite, tea bags, etc. So there's all kinds of areas that forestry is used. And in each of these three areas, I've just focused on those three areas because that's really what the forum's talking about. We've adapted to changing times. And those times have been sometimes difficult, and I certainly recognize that. But innovation helps us adapt to those changing times. So whether it's in any of these areas, I think the pine beetle was certainly one of those worst times to some extent for us, and we're still living through it in terms of our fiber and fiber cut and so on. Yet on the other hand, we've been able to adapt to some extent to that short window to harvest the dead wood, to work between government and industry, et cetera, to make that happen, using cutting-edge equipment. We are the best in the world when it comes to the sawmills here, et cetera, which is excellent. And so new opportunities are coming out of that. And in my area that I was involved with genomics, we had projects looking at how to select for trees that had resistance, for example, to pine beetle into the future. So there's many innovations in operations, and many of these examples have been talked about at this conference, so I won't go through them. But they are very interesting because this convergence of two rivers is happening. And the issue for us is how do we make it happen in such a way that it really benefits British Columbia? Lamazoo, we've talked about, is really 3D visualization. Earthcast being a satellite imagery company. SST wireless sensors. We talked about Industry 4.0 and the ability to use the Internet of Things there. Motion metrics, using both artificial intelligence and 3D machine vision for mining. MindSense we've talked about in this conference, a really exciting company. Dark Vision and others, and there are many others there. So where did this technology come from? And where do these two rivers come to get together? Well, part of it is that what we talk about as the tech sector is really not the tech sector. We have a tech-enabled economy. But there are pieces of the tech sector which I call tech-producing sectors. And I talked about MDA, and I talked about the digital world around the digital sectors. Today, this tech-producing sector, if you like, or this group, which KPMG and others put into this bucket, is about 10,000 companies, about 110,000 people. And many of these companies are not tech companies, but they're tech applied to the various sectors that we've talked about. So the ICT industry, of course, has been a traditional one, software and enterprise solutions, including mobile technologies, big data, machine learning, et cetera. Clean tech, we've talked a lot at this conference about clean technology, digital media, VR and AR, et cetera, and BC's life science sector as well. In the life science sector, it's interesting because I think that's also going digital. So the understanding of our lives, if you like, our organisms at the DNA level is really a way of simulating biology, if you like, at a digital level. And I think many of the discussions we have into the future will just include biology in that way as we look at impact on environment, impact of fracking fluids on the environment, things like that. We have to be able to understand the biology just as well as we understand everything else. So if you look then at how that diffuses across the economy, and that's really the message, that while the traditional tech-producing sectors has this area, if you like, of developing technology, we also have in the middle there tech-related sectors, which are really tech products per se, and that's a significant part of our economy. And then we've got the rest of the economy, which is a big part, the biggest part, including construction, retail, et cetera, which are tech-enabled, and we've heard a lot about that here. So retail, you can talk about Lululemon. Finance, you can talk about FinAI. Construction, you could talk to Brian Yates about Stantec, etc. It's really quite interesting. The next level I'd like to talk about is, that's good, and we need to be then thinking about new products. And this is an area where it's a difficult one, because I think we've had a discussion around value-added products, but it also means going up the value chain. And there are a lot of companies that are involved in this area. I've just picked out 3 of them: Phoenix, West Fraser, for example, Merit, etc. And Canfor, we talked about being there yesterday. We also had John Cox talking about Canapux, etc. as well. Those are really interesting new product opportunities. But why is innovation difficult in this area? It's difficult a little bit because I think we have a bit of an issue around sometimes thinking of intangible assets. Most of the successful companies deal with tangible assets, but more and more in the economy we're moving into, it's intangible assets that are making a difference. In fact, on the S&P 500, 84% of the assets today are intangible assets. If you buy a company, and all of us know about that, you have this thing called goodwill on the books. That's really a way of explaining, well, the company's actually worth more than we're currently got in our fixed assets. So it's important, because that's really where BC talent becomes important. It's this area of the intangible economy. It usually deals in sunk costs. Once you do R&D, it's sunk. You generate spillovers into other places. You're likely to be scalable, and there are synergies between different groups. So the traditional model, to some extent, needs to be rethought when we are in the intangible economy, and that's really where the new products and new businesses are. Financing can be difficult at times in this area. If we look at examples around the world, though, we were just talking at our table about Australia, and I think the bureaucracy gets a little nervous when I compare us sometimes to BC, for good reason. But I think, on the other hand, there are things we can learn from different areas. Australia, for example, has about the same impact on GDP for their value-added services, or their up-the-food chain services, or their engineering services around mining, as they do on the extractive side. Imagine if that were the same here. The same in Finland, the same in Norway. Chile is coming up that road fast. So we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity to develop a significant part of our economy based on the competitiveness that we already have. And key resource companies play a key role in that area. They play a key role really as the intelligent users, and sometimes as well as the encouragers or venture capitalists for small companies as they come around. I know tech has done that, for example. So if we look at the next area, which is really new business models, then this is a really interesting area, because it may not apply across the board, but I think it's more and more doing that. And we've talked about the digitization of business to some extent. We've talked about the supercluster, and Bill Tam gave a very good talk on the supercluster. The Forest Machine Connectivity Group, including Timber West and Canfor, FP Innovations, UBC, and also the Earth Data Store, which will be important to us with Geoscience BC, EarthCast, Microsoft, BC Geo, UBC, and UVic. But more and more, the companies are actually moving into the digital world themselves. I, many years ago, dealt with Finning when they were a Caterpillar dealer. And Finning, to some extent, had a very interesting time where they realized that really Caterpillar was not monitoring all the equipment in a way that they would like to see. Caterpillar had tried to do that, but it wasn't terribly useful on their equipment. So Finning decided to do that. And Finning then created, much later after that, Finning Digital. Today, Finning Digital, I think, is about a third of their total revenue comes from their digital services. I mean, that's amazing for a world-class Caterpillar dealer. Ritchie Brothers, now $5 billion or so, and that's all through extensions of their digital business. And that really comes about because In the diagram in the supercluster that was shown, this is actually a generic diagram which applies right across business. And it applies really by making sure that we can put data visualization, data analysis, and data collection at a world-class level to every single one of our vertical markets and every single one of our companies. So this is why Amazon buys Whole Foods, which bothered me when they first did that. And the second area, I think, is that they see the opportunity here for understanding better what is going on in the business and using that data to be more productive. I mean, Amazon got their start to some extent, at least in some of these areas, by buying Abe Books in Victoria. And at the time Abe Books was sold, they had something like 110 million books around the world registered on their website. And that was just a small company in Victoria. So tools like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and so on, this is really the convergence between the physical, digital, and biological worlds. And it's really important for us to be ahead of that. So this then is really what we talk about as the data-driven economy. We're entering this for all of our businesses. And it requires participation in this big data, the data that we collect. And we have to make sure in this process that we protect the intellectual property. We allow the data to be accessed. We want all of our tech community and the companies to be writing applications on this. And the second thing that it brings to bear is really making sure that we put in the right infrastructure. So the infrastructure in the data-driven world becomes connectivity. And we want to make sure that in BC we have the full participation in the digital economy. I've had a little bit to do with Connected Coast, and Patrick Kelly, who's the board chair of Coastal First Nations. And this is a really exciting project. But this Connected Coast project will essentially, it's 3,400 kilometers of cable, 154 communities on it. And it's interesting, Denise Williams, who's the executive director of the First Nations Technology Council, said, connectivity is foundational to Indigenous peoples leading and thriving in a digital age for generations to come. And wouldn't it be great to have an innovation district in every one of those 154 communities so the young people didn't feel as if they needed to go just to Vancouver. They could operate in these areas. And again, there's more detail from Susan Stanford and her office. But this is really a way of showing that federally, provincially, and with communities, we can really make this happen. Finally, there are global trends pushing us. And so we can't ignore those trends. Those trends include demographics or technological disruption, urbanization, and so on. But as we imagine a future for BC, we have to be aware that these global trends are already influencing our economies and communities, and they can have an impact. And so as a society, we can either deal proactively with these trends and enhance the future, or let them disrupt our future. And I think I'm much more of an optimist. I think a lot of these trends that we talk about are actually the trends of the next generation. So whether we talk about Generation X, Y, or Z, or millennials, or whatever, many of the things here are really important. When I was going through university, it was the space business was exciting. Today, you talk to young people, it's saving our planet, it's being involved with the environment, etc. And I think a lot of these trends that we see, we can harness in the next generation. It's exciting to me. And as I mentioned, I think if the next wave of innovation is around sustainability, I think BC will be well positioned. So imagine our future at the forefront of this wave, with government, industry, and academia pulling together towards a clean growth future. So in summary, that leads us to a future for BC that we all want to see. And we very much want to catch that wave of innovation towards a future where our children will have a higher quality of life, more opportunities, and a stronger, more sustainable economy in a world that is cleaner, greener, and more vibrant for decades to come. It's a better BC for everyone. Thank you very much.